If there is a dark power which malevolently and treacherously places a thread within us with which to hold us and draw us down a perilous and pernicious path that we would never otherwise have set foot on, if there is such a power, then it must take the same form as we do. It must become our very self, for only in this way can we believe in it and give it the scope it requires to accomplish its secret task. If our minds, strengthened by a cheerful life, are resolute enough to recognize alien and malevolent influences for what they are, and to proceed tranquilly along the path to which our inclinations and our vocation have directed us, the uncanny power must surely perish in a vain struggle to assume the form which is our own reflection. Have you ever read The Sandman? It's about a guy named Nathaniel. He falls in love with a girl, but she turns out to be a machine. He has nightmares about the Sandman, a monster who threatens to steal away his eyes in the night. Pretty eyes, pretty eyes. Can you really trust that what you're seeing is reality? A few months ago, there was a streamer named Pokimane, and she unveiled a avatar that was basically a VTuber, and people took issue with it. I can't get into the whole controversy, but one of the main reasons was that people didn't see Pokimane as a VTuber, or a real VTuber, that is. They thought she was intruding on their spaces, and there was a lot of backlash. I could do a whole video dissecting the reaction to Pokimane's VTuber avatar, and honestly, I probably should, but for now, I want to zero in on a specific post, because on September 13th, 2020, one user on Twitter wrote this.
Pokimane becoming a VTuber is so funny to me because the appeal of VTubers has always been a person playing a character behind the scenes. All Pokimane did was turn herself into a 3D model. I see why people are upset, but she can do whatever the hell she wants, I guess. I think people are weirded out by her being a VTuber because it's like a gray area between fiction and reality. I feel it opens the door to some creepy shit, but you know, it's probably not anything too serious. It's very fucking uncanny.
This post, which I think is deleted now, so you're just gonna have to trust me, it caught my attention because it focuses on a lot of the areas of VTubing that I find really interesting. The way that it highlights differences between what's fictional and what's real, and it also focuses on a specific word, uncanny. Now, most people will probably know Uncanny from a Vsauce video on creepiness called Why Are Things Creepy, where they discuss the uncanny valley, and that's probably a good place to start. If you're not familiar, basically, there exists this sort of inverted bell curve of creepiness. The idea that there might be some element of horror lurking within VTubers is kinda weird because the entire point is that they're supposed to be cute or beautiful or handsome, but as anyone who's ever hidden under their covers from the glassy-eyed stare of a doll will know, the line between beauty and terror is often quite thin. And it's that tension that I think might play a role in how the technology behind VTubing has evolved. Around 2015 to 16, I started getting into the YouTube channel of a Japanese lady named Eileen. It featured simple anime-style comedy skits and vlogs brought to life with basic 2D animation. Eileen and her family's voices were created using text-to-speech, but the voiceover still managed to come across as funny, with great comedic timing. I didn't know then, but I was watching a VTuber for the first time. Later in 2016, Kizuna Ai really blew the lid off the Japanese YouTube scene. She made a splash so big that the rest of the world couldn't help but take notice. Coming at a time when virtual reality was still receiving a lot of hype, Kizuna Ai was the future come to life. Advanced motion tracking software, a 3D model on par with Hatsune Miku, a talented voice actress, all in a YouTube channel. Then, sometime around early 2020, VTuber was redefined again. Hololive had been around before then, but it was really at the turn of the decade when they came into their own. Unlike Kizuna Ai, Hololive's VTubers primarily livestream instead of posting edited videos, and instead of costly motion capture software, they use a technology called Live 2D. Hololive's usage of Live 2D came with some significant benefits. Firstly, it was significantly easier to produce content. By this time, even Kizuna Ai had begun live streaming, but Hololive had this medium down to a fine art. Live 2D rigs can be controlled using facial recognition software on smartphones, meaning that recording no longer takes place in studios but can be brought home. This brings with it the possibility for guerrilla streams scheduled and announced on very short notice. Additionally, Live 2D is significantly cheaper. Without the equipment associated with 3D recording, the overall costs are dramatically reduced. These factors, ease of use and accessibility, radically altered what it meant to be a VTuber. Now, anyone can be a VTuber. You can be a VTuber. At least that's what I thought. It turns out the 2D 3D dichotomy isn't as useful as I initially thought. I did some research and discovered koikatsu. Okay, I already knew about koikatsu. The point is, people have figured out that there's an even cheaper and faster alternative to commissioning or drawing a live 2D model, and ironically, it's 3D models. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not belittling or otherwise detracting from the people who put hours of work into their VTuber models, but these programs like Vroid Studio and Koikatsu that allow people to create 3D models without a background in 3D design, well, they're without a doubt the budget option. So that got me thinking, why?
We've seen not so much a continued progression toward 3D that we might conventionally expect, but we've seen a democratization of the technology so that people with fewer resources than the team behind Kizuna Ai can get into virtual idols. People who have access to an illustrator and a live 2D animator can create their own VTuber character with relatively limited resources.
This is Forrest Greenwood, author of several papers that in no small part inspired a great deal of my channel and my current understanding of VTubers. I had a chat with him about VTubers and his insights were illuminating.
From a technical perspective, it's possible to say that the live 2D VTubers that we're seeing crop up are perhaps less technologically developed. They have fewer points of articulation in the animated figure. They have a more limited range of motion that they can capture. They can't necessarily capture the VTuber moving their arms or their hands the way that a 3D avatar can. But you also see a sense where the 2D avatar is desired in its own right. I'm thinking of the example of the independent YouTuber Zentrea, who plays kind of a dragon girl character. And Zentrea went from a very highly articulated 3D avatar and recently went to a relatively unarticulated live 2D avatar. And that seems to have been regarded as a positive change, as something that the performer themselves was very interested in undergoing. There was a kind of, almost like there's a kind of prestige attached to the live 2D avatar, even though it's not necessarily as technologically developed as the 3D avatar.
Here I want to zero in on the less technically sophisticated and more abstract nature of live 2D, and bring us back to Pokimane. The model of the Uncanny Valley proposes that as something approaches being human, it will become uncanny, disturbing. And in a way, I guess that the embrace of a more abstract representation is a way to get away from this tendency towards uncanniness. Models like this that make every effort to differentiate between what's outside the screen and what's inside might be an important technology to help mediate our parasocial relationships with virtual avatars. But as neat and tidy as that is, there is still something missing. Her 3D model wasn't the only reason that Pokimane was uncanny. No, it was the specific juxtaposition of the VTuber aesthetic with the fact that people already knew Pokimane as a real person. In a sense, she was between the worlds of virtuality and reality. She was almost real, almost human, but just not quite, and that is what was disturbing. It calls into question our ability to perceive reality.
With VTubers and the distinction between performer and character, I think one thing that's particularly fascinating is the tension within the VTuber fandom about doxing performers and finding out their real life information. Because on the one hand, it's kind of an open secret that some of the VTuber idols have had previous streaming careers, and fans are aware of this and know that so and so who's playing this character is actually this cosplayer or this voice actor or such and such. But there's a tension within the fan community between people who seem to want to engage in this kind of doxing and reveal the face behind the character, and fans who want to retain the integrity of the character and who say no, we're not interested in being fans of this character. We're not interested in breaking the boundary of the screen and diving into the personal life of the actor behind the character. We want to just engage in this character and in this performance of the character. So we don't want you to go on and do any kind of doxing. And if you do, we don't want to hear about it.
E.T.A. Hoffmann was a German author who wrote a bunch of fairy tales, including The Nutcracker. But today I want to talk about two of the ones he wrote, The Sandman and The Golden Pot. The Sandman is, in many respects, a horror story. It depicts a slow descent into madness and cyborg body horror. Sigmund Freud used the Sandman in his well-known essay, The Uncanny. There, he ties the uncanny horror of the Sandman to the motif of eyes that pervade the story. The main character, Nathaniel, is haunted by the terror of having his eyes stolen by the mythological Sandman. But then Freud does some weird crap about castration and tries to apply his psychoanalysis theories, and honestly, I don't have time to go into why I think Freud is full of crap. But I do think Freud was right that there's something uncanny about the eyes in the Sandman. Nathaniel is in love with Olympia, who is a girl that we later discover is in fact a robot. In the horrific reveal, Nathaniel discovers Olympia's lifeless body with her eyes missing. The obsession with eyes, Nathaniel's fear of losing his, and the depiction of Olympia's eyes as uncanny has a lot to do with unpacking how we perceive reality. Danielle Geistfeld regards the usage of eyes as conveying a fear of an inability to trust one's own eyesight. This fear is fundamentally tied to uncanniness, something that looks like it belongs, but is somehow wrong. So what the hell does that have to do with VTubers? Well, I've talked before about concepts of virtual reality. Basically, VTubers exist in a sort of constructed reality that, while not physical, still acts on us. The screen is, in many ways, a window into another world. At the very least, we often act as if it is.
One of the influences that I had during my time when I was getting my master's, when I wrote the Spectator article on Hatsune Miku, was Dr. Akira Mizuto Lippet at the University of Southern California, which is where I got my MA. He wasn't my advisor, but I spent a good deal of time talking with him. And one of his books, Atomic Light Shadow Optics, he introduces the notion of the membrane from, I believe he's borrowing it from Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari, where the membrane is different from the window in that the window presents a sort of transparency, right? It promises a clear view into the space that's framed by the window, right? So there's a perception, and Friedberg highlights this by noting that early Renaissance windows, were not made of glass. You could freely pass through them. So the window denotes not just visual transparency, but conceptual and physical transparency. You can pass through a window as if it were a door, but the membrane is only semi-permeable. Light can pass through the membrane, but you can't physically pass through it. And I think the membrane is kind of an increasingly useful tool for examining how otaku in particular engage with screens, because there seems to be this sense in which no matter how hard we try to tear down the screen and make the characters seem as if they're in the same space as us, there's always going to be something, whether it's visual or paratextual or some other element, that's going to draw our attention to the conditions of mediation. That's going to remind us that this is in fact a mediated experience of a character and not the character actually being out in the physical world. It might be the limitations of the technology. The early Hatsune Miku concerts back in 2009 where the projection was pretty grainy and low resolution. And so that drew your attention to the fact that this was, especially in close-up shots, a constructed performance, that this isn't really Miku up there on stage. It's this character mediated through a transparent screen projection technology. And I think that's always going to be a challenge for anime media mix works and for VTubers, is that the more that you try to pretend as though the screen isn't there, the more that the screen will find ways, isn't the correct way to put it, but the more that people will be aware that the screen is there in some way, shape, or form. It's just going to draw attention to the fact that this is a mediated interaction and not an interaction that's occurring in the same physical space.
So, to resolve some of this anxiety, I'd like to bring us back to E.T.A. Hoffmann. I talked about the Sandman briefly, and I'd like to conclude by mentioning another story, The Golden Pot. In The Golden Pot, we follow Anselmus, a student whose life has thus far been unfulfilling. Suddenly, after a day full of disappointment and sadness, he hears a voice. He's enraptured by what seems to be a golden and green snake beckoning him from a tree with seductive blue eyes. Throughout the story, we see Anselmus and those around him struggle with the existence of two worlds: the world of reality, of physics, of day-to-day labor, and the world of magic and fantasy, Atlantis. Anselmus falls deeply in love with the snake who is named Serpentina, and though those around him call him mad, he eventually finds fulfillment in the world of Atlantis and marries Serpentina, leaving behind his former reality. We end the book with the narrator, who is recording Anselmus's tale, lamenting that he'll be forced to return to his life of poverty, that he won't find happiness in Atlantis like Anselmus. And yet, he's told that he has actually entered Atlantis, that Anselmus's happiness is a life in poetry. The Golden Pot ends with the conclusion that although the existence of worlds outside of reality can produce uncanniness and horror, we can also find beauty in them, and we can take pleasure in glimpsing these fantastical virtual worlds, even if it's through a membrane, even if only for a moment. Through our poetry, our stories, and our art. Thank you for watching, and have a wonderful day.